Doña Soledad seemed to be explaining something to the four women who surrounded her. She moved her arms in dramatic gestures and held her head in her hands. It was obvious she was telling them about me. I drove up the driveway to where I had been parked before. I intended to wait for them there. I deliberated whether to remain in the car or to sit casually on the left fender. I opted to stand by the car door, ready to jump in and drive away if something like the events of the previous day were going to be repeated. I was very tired. I hadn't slept a wink for over 24 hours. My plan was to disclose to the young women as much as I could about the incident with Doña Soledad so they could take the necessary steps to aid her, and then I would leave. Their presence had brought about a definite change. Everything seemed to be charged with new vigor and energy. I felt the change when I saw Doña Soledad surrounded by them. Doña Soledad's revelation that they were Don Juan's apprentices had given them such a tantalizing appeal that I could hardly wait to meet them. I wondered if they were like Doña Soledad. She had said that they were like myself, and that we were going in the same direction. That could be easily interpreted in a positive sense. I wanted to believe that more than anything else. Don Juan used to call them Las Hermanitas, the little sisters, a most befitting name, at least for the two I had met, Lydia and Rosa, two wispy, pixie-like, charming young women. I figured that they must have been in their early 20s when I had met them, although Pablito and Nestor always refused to talk about their ages. The other two, Josefina and Elena, were a total mystery to me. I used to hear their names being mentioned from time to time, always in some unfavorable context. I had deduced from passing remarks made by Don Juan that they were somehow freakish. One was crazy and the other obese. Thus, they were kept in isolation. Once I bumped into Josefina as I walked into the house with Don Juan. He introduced me to her, but she covered her face and ran away before I had time to greet her. Another time, I caught Elena washing clothes. She was enormous. I thought that she must be suffering from a glandular disorder. I said hello to her, but she didn't turn around. I never saw her face. After the build-up that Doña Soledad had given them with her disclosure, I felt driven to talk with the mysterious hermanitas, and at the same time, I was almost afraid of them. I casually looked down the driveway, bracing myself to meet all of them at once. The driveway was deserted. There was no one approaching, and only a minute before, they had been no more than 30 yards from the house. I climbed up on the roof of the car to look. There was no one coming, not even the dog. I panicked. I slid down and was about to jump in the car and drive away when I heard someone say, "Hey, look who's here." I quickly turned around to face two girls who had just stepped out of the house. I deduced that all of them must have run ahead of me and entered the house through the back door. I sighed with relief. The two young girls came toward me. I had to admit to myself that I had never really noticed them before. They were beautiful, dark, and extremely lean, but without being skinny. Their long black hair was braided. They wore plain skirts, blue denim jackets, and low-heeled, soft-soled brown shoes. They were bare-legged, and their legs were shapely and muscular. They must have been about 5'3" or 5'4". They seemed to be very physical. They moved with great prowess. One of them was Lydia. The other was Rosa. I greeted them, and then, in unison, they initiated a handshake. They flanked me. They looked healthy and vigorous. I asked them to help me get the packages out of the trunk. As we were carrying them into the house, I heard a deep growl, so deep and near that it seemed more like a lion's roar. "What was that?" I asked Lydia. "Don't you know?" she asked, with a tone of disbelief. "It must be the dog," Rosa said, as they ran into the house, practically dragging me with them. We placed the packages on the table and sat on two benches. Both girls were facing me. I told them that Doña Soledad was very ill, and that I was about to take her to the hospital in the city since I didn't know what else to do to help her. As I spoke, I realized that I was treading on dangerous ground. I had no way of assessing how much information I should divulge to them about the true nature of my bout with Doña Soledad. I began to look for clues. I thought that if I watched carefully, their voices or the expression on their faces would betray how much they knew, but they remained silent and let me do all the talking. I began to doubt that I should volunteer any information at all. In my effort to figure out what to do and not blunder, I ended up talking nonsense. Lydia cut me off. In a dry tone, she said that I should not concern myself with Doña Soledad's health because they had already taken steps to help her. That statement forced me to ask her if she knew what Doña Soledad's trouble was. "You've taken her soul," she said accusingly. My first reaction was to defend myself. I began to talk vehemently, but ended up contradicting myself. They stared at me. I was making no sense at all. I tried again to say the same thing in a different way. My fatigue was so intense that I could hardly organize my thoughts. Finally, I gave up. "Where are Pablito and Nestor?" I asked after a long pause. "They'll be here shortly," Lydia said briskly. "Were you with them?" I asked. "No," she exclaimed and stared at me. "We never go together," Rosa explained. "Those bums are different from us." Lydia made an imperative gesture with her foot to shut her up. She seemed to be the one who gave the orders. Catching the movement of her feet brought to my awareness a most peculiar facet of my relationship with Don Juan. In the countless times that we had roamed together, he had succeeded in teaching me, without really trying, a system of covert communication through some coded movements of the feet. I watched Lydia give Rosa the sign for horrible, a sign given when anything that happens to be in sight of the signers is unpleasant or dangerous. In this case, me. I laughed. I remembered that Don Juan had given me that sign when I first met Don Genaro. I pretended not to be aware of what was going on in order to find out if I could decode all their signs. Rosa made the sign that she wanted to step on me. Lydia answered with an imperative sign for no. According to Don Juan, Lydia was very talented. As far as he was concerned, she was more sensitive and alert than Pablito and Nestor and myself. I had always been incapable of making friends with her. She was aloof and very cutting. She had enormous, black, shifty eyes that never looked straight at anyone, high cheekbones and a chiseled nose, which was a bit flat and broad at the bridge. I remembered her having red, sore eyelids, and everyone taunting her on account of that. The redness of her eyelids had disappeared, but she continued to rub her eyes and blink a great deal. During my years of association with Don Juan and Don Genaro, I had seen Lydia the most, and yet we had probably never exchanged more than a dozen words with each other. Pablito regarded her as a most dangerous being. I always thought she was just extremely shy. Rosa, on the other hand, was very boisterous. I thought she was the youngest. Her eyes were very frank and shiny. She was never shifty, but very bad-tempered. I had talked with Rosa more than anyone else. She was friendly, very bold, and very funny. "Where are the others?" I asked Rosa. "Aren't they going to come out?" "They will be out shortly," Lydia answered. I could tell from their expressions that friendliness was not what they had in mind. Judging from their foot messages, they were as dangerous as Doña Soledad, and yet, as I sat there looking at them, it occurred to me that they were gorgeously beautiful. I had the warmest feelings for them. In fact, the more they stared into my eyes, the more intense that feeling became. At one moment, it was sheer passion that I felt for them. They were so alluring that I could have sat there for hours just looking at them, but a sobering thought made me stand up. I was not going to repeat my bungling of the night before. I decided that the best defense was to put my cards on the table. In a firm tone, I told them that Don Juan had set up some sort of trial for me using Doña Soledad, or vice versa. Chances were that he had also set them up in the same fashion, and we were going to be pitted against one another in some sort of battle that could result in injury to some of us. I appealed to their sense of warriorship. If they were the truthful heirs of Don Juan, they had to be impeccable with me, reveal their designs, and not behave like ordinary, greedy human beings. I turned to Rosa and asked her the reason for wishing to step on me. She was taken aback for an instant, and then she became angry. Her eyes flared with rage, her small mouth contracted. Lydia, in a very coherent manner, said that I had nothing to fear from them and that Rosa was angry with me because I had hurt Doña Soledad. Her feelings were purely a personal reaction. I said then that it was time I left. I stood up. Lydia made a gesture to stop me. She seemed scared or deeply concerned. She began to protest when a noise coming from outside the door distracted me. The two girls jumped to my side. Something heavy was leaning or pushing against the door. I noticed then that the girls had secured it with the heavy iron bar. I had a feeling of disgust. The whole affair was going to be repeated again, and I was sick and tired of it all. The girls glanced at each other, then looked at me, and then looked at each other again. I heard the whining and heavy breathing of a large animal outside the house. It might have been the dog. Exhaustion blinded me at that point. I rushed to the door, removed the heavy iron bar, and started to open it. Lydia threw herself against the door and shut it again. "The Nagual was right," she said, out of breath. "You think and think. You're dumber than I thought." She pulled me back to the table. I rehearsed in my mind the best way to tell them once and for all that I had had enough. Rosa sat next to me, touching me. I could feel her leg nervously rubbing against mine. Lydia was standing, facing me, looking at me fixedly. Her burning black eyes seemed to be saying something I couldn't understand. I began to speak, but I didn't finish. I had a sudden and most profound awareness. My body was aware of a greenish light, a fluorescence outside the house. I didn't see or hear anything. I was simply aware of the light, as if I were suddenly falling asleep and my thoughts were turning into images that were superimposed on the world of everyday life. The light was moving at a great speed. I could sense it with my stomach. I followed it, or rather I focused my attention on it for an instant as it moved around. A great clarity of mind ensued from focusing my attention on the light. I knew then that in that house, in the presence of those people, it was wrong and dangerous to behave as an innocent bystander. "Aren't you afraid?" Rosa asked, pointing to the door. Her voice disrupted my concentration. I admitted that whatever was there was scaring me at a very deep level, enough to make me die of fright. I wanted to say more, but right then I had a surge of wrath, and I wanted to see and talk with Doña Soledad. I didn't trust her. I went directly to her room. She wasn't there. I began to call her, bellowing her name. The house had one more room. I pushed the door open and rushed inside. There was no one in there. My anger increased in the same proportion as my fear. I went out the back door and walked around to the front. Not even the dog was in sight. I banged on the front door furiously. Lydia opened it. I entered. I yelled at her to tell me where everybody was. She lowered her eyes and didn't answer. She wanted to close the door, but I wouldn't let her. She quickly walked away and went into the other room. I sat down again at the table. Rosa had not moved. She seemed to be frozen on the spot. "We're the same," she said suddenly. "The Nagual told us that." "Tell me, then, what was prowling around the house?" I asked. "The ally," she said. "Where is it now?" "It is still here. It won't go. The moment you're weak, it'll squash you. But we're not the ones who can tell you anything." "Who can tell me, then?" "La Gorda!" Rosa exclaimed, opening her eyes as wide as she could. "She's the one. She knows everything." Rosa asked me if she could close the door, just to be on the safe side. Without waiting for an answer, she inched her way to the door and slammed it shut. "There is nothing we can do except wait until everyone is here," she said. Lydia came back into the room with a package, an object, wrapped up in a piece of dark yellow cloth. She seemed very relaxed. I noticed that she had a most commandeering touch. Somehow, she imparted her mood to Rosa and myself. "Do you know what I have here?" she asked me. I didn't have the vaguest idea. She began to unwrap it in a very deliberate manner, taking her time. Then she stopped and looked at me. She seemed to vacillate. She grinned as if she were too shy to show what was in the bundle. "This package was left by the Nagual for you," she muttered. "But I think we'd better wait for La Gorda." I insisted that she unwrap it. She gave me a ferocious look and took the package out of the room without saying another word. I enjoyed Lydia's game. She had performed something quite in line with Don Juan's teachings. She had given me a demonstration of how to get the best use out of an average situation. By bringing the package to me and pretending that she was going to open it, after disclosing that Don Juan had left it for me, she had indeed created a mystery that was almost unbearable. She knew that I had to stay if I wanted to find out the contents of that package. I could think of a number of things that might be in that bundle. Perhaps it was the pipe Don Juan used when handling psychotropic mushrooms. He had intimated that the pipe would be given to me for safekeeping. Or it might have been his knife, or his leather pouch, or even his sorcery power objects. On the other hand, it might have been merely a ploy on Lydia's part. Don Juan was too sophisticated, too abstract to leave me an heirloom. I told Rosa that I was dead on my feet and weak from hunger. My idea was to drive to the city, rest for a couple of days, and then come back to see Pablito and Nestor. I said that by then I might even get to meet the other two girls. Lydia returned then, and Rosa told her of my intention to leave. "The Nagual gave us orders to attend to you as if you were himself," Lydia said. "We are all the Nagual himself, but you are even more so, for some reason that no one understands." Both of them talked to me at once and guaranteed in various ways that no one was going to attempt anything against me, as Doña Soledad had. Both of them had such a fierce look of honesty in their eyes that my body was overwhelmed. I trusted them. "You must stay until La Gorda comes back," Lydia said. "The Nagual said that you should sleep in his bed," Rosa added. I began to pace the floor in the throes of a weird dilemma. On the one hand, I wanted to stay and rest. I felt physically at ease and happy in their presence, something I had not felt the day before with Doña Soledad. My reasonable side, on the other hand, had not relaxed at all. At that level, I was as frightened as I had been all along. I had had moments of blind despair and had taken bold actions, but after the momentum of those actions had ceased, I had felt as vulnerable as ever. I engaged in some soul-searching analysis as I paced the room, almost frantically. The two girls remained quiet, looking at me anxiously. Then, all of a sudden, the riddle was solved. I knew that something in me was just pretending to be afraid. I had become accustomed to reacting that way in Don Juan's presence. Throughout the years of our association, I had relied heavily on him to furnish me with convenient pacifiers for my fright. My dependency on him had given me solace and security, but it was no longer tenable. Don Juan was gone. His apprentices didn't have his patience or his sophistication or his sheer command. With them, my need to seek solace was plain stupidity. The girls led me to the other room. The window faced the southeast, and so did the bed, which was a thick mat like a mattress. A 2-foot-long, bulky piece of maguey stalk had been carved so that the porous tissue served as a pillow or a neck rest. In the middle part of it, there was a gentle dip. The surface of the maguey was very smooth. It appeared to have been hand-rubbed. I tried the bed and the pillow. The comfort and bodily satisfaction I experienced were unusual. Lying on Don Juan's bed, I felt secure and fulfilled. An unequaled peace swept through my body. I had had a similar feeling once before when Don Juan had made a bed for me on top of a hill in the desert in northern Mexico. I fell asleep. I woke up in the early evening. Lydia and Rosa were nearly on top of me, sound asleep. I stayed motionless for 1 or 2 seconds, then both of them woke up at once. Lydia yawned and said that they had had to sleep next to me in order to protect me and make me rest. I was famished. Lydia sent Rosa to the kitchen to make us some food. In the meantime, she lit all the lanterns in the house. When the food was ready, we sat down at the table. I felt as if I had known them or been with them all my life. We ate in silence. When Rosa was clearing the table, I asked Lydia if all of them slept in the Nagual's bed. It was the only other bed in the house beside Doña Soledad's. Lydia said in a matter-of-fact tone that they had moved out of that house years before to a place of their own in the same vicinity, and that Pablito had also moved when they did, and lived with Nestor and Benigno. "But what's happened to you people? I thought that you were all together," I said. "Not anymore," Lydia replied. "Since the Nagual left, we have had separate tasks. The Nagual joined us, and the Nagual took us apart." "And where's the Nagual now?" I asked, in the most casual tone I could affect. Both of them looked at me, and then glanced at each other. "Oh, we don't know," Lydia said. "He and Genaro left." She seemed to be telling the truth, but I insisted once more that they tell me what they knew. "We really don't know anything," Lydia snapped at me, obviously flustered by my questions. "They moved to another area. You have to ask that question of La Gorda. She has something to tell you. She knew yesterday that you would come, and we rushed all night to get here. We were afraid that you were dead. The Nagual told us that you are the only one we should help and trust. He said that you are himself." She covered her face and giggled, and then added as an afterthought, "But that's hard to believe." "We don't know you," Rosa said. "That's the trouble. The 4 of us feel the same way. We were afraid that you were dead, and then when we saw you, we got mad at you for not being dead. Soledad is like our mother, maybe more than that." They exchanged conspiratorial looks with each other. I immediately interpreted that as a sign of trouble. They were up to no good. Lydia noticed my sudden distrust, which must have been written all over my face. She reacted with a series of assertions about their desire to help me. I really had no reason to doubt their sincerity. If they had wanted to hurt me, they could have done so while I was asleep. She sounded so earnest that I felt petty. I decided to distribute the gifts I had brought for them. I told them that there were unimportant trinkets in the packages, and that they could choose any one they liked. Lydia said that they would prefer it if I assigned the gifts myself. In a very polite tone, she added that they would be grateful if I would also cure Soledad. "What do you think I should do to cure her?" I asked her, after a long silence. "Use your double," she said, in a matter-of-fact tone. I carefully went over the fact that Doña Soledad had nearly assassinated me, and that I had survived by the grace of something in me which was neither my skill nor my knowledge. As far as I was concerned, that undefined something that seemed to have delivered a blow to her was real, but unreachable. In short, I couldn't help Doña Soledad any more than I could walk to the moon. They listened to me attentively and remained quiet but agitated. "Where's Doña Soledad now?" I asked Lydia. "She's with La Gorda," she said in a despondent tone. "La Gorda took her away and is trying to cure her, but we really don't know where they are. That's the truth." "And where's Josefina?" "She went to get the witness. He's the only one who can cure Soledad. Rosa thinks that you know more than the witness, but since you're angry with Soledad, you want her dead. We don't blame you." I assured them that I wasn't angry with her, and above all, I did not want her dead. "Cure her, then," Rosa said, in an angry, high-pitched voice. "The witness has told us that you always know what to do, and the witness can't be wrong." "And who in the devil is the witness?" "Nestor is the witness," Lydia said, as if she were reluctant to voice his name. "You know that. You have to." I remembered that, during our last meeting, Don Genaro had called Nestor the witness. I thought at the time that the name was a joke, or a ploy that Don Genaro was using to ease the gripping tension and the anguish of those last moments together. "That was no joke," Lydia said, in a firm voice. Genaro and the Nagual followed a different path with the witness. They took him along with them everywhere they went, and I mean everywhere. The witness has witnessed all there is to witness. Obviously, there was a tremendous misunderstanding between us. I labored to explain that I was practically a stranger to them. Don Juan had kept me away from everyone, including Pablito and Nestor. Outside of the casual hellos and goodbyes that all of them had exchanged with me over the years, we had never actually talked. I knew all of them mainly through the descriptions that Don Juan had given me. Although I had once met Josefina, I couldn't remember what she looked like, and all I had ever seen of La Gorda was her gigantic behind. I said to them that I hadn't even known until the day before that the four of them were Don Juan's apprentices, and that Benigno was part of the group as well. They exchanged a coy look with each other. Rosa moved her lips to say something, but Lydia gave her a command with her feet. I felt that, after my long and soulful explanation, they should not still sneak messages to each other. My nerves were so taut that their covert foot movements were just the thing to send me into a rage. I yelled at them at the top of my lungs and banged on the table with my right hand. Rosa stood up with unbelievable speed, and I suppose as a response to her sudden movement, my body, by itself, without the notice of my reason, moved a step back, just in time to avoid by inches a blow from a massive stick or some heavy object that Rosa was wielding in her left hand. It came down on the table with a thunderous noise. I heard again, as I had heard the night before while Doña Soledad was choking me, a most peculiar and mysterious sound, a dry sound, like a pipe breaking, right behind my windpipe at the base of my neck. My ears popped, and with the speed of lightning, my left arm came down on top of Rosa's stick and crushed it. I saw the whole scene myself, as if I'd been watching a movie. Rosa screamed, and I realized then that I had leaned forward with all my weight and had struck the back of her hand with my left fist. I was appalled. Whatever was happening to me was not real. It was a nightmare. Rosa kept on screaming. Lydia took her into Don Juan's room. I heard her yells of pain for a few moments longer, and then they stopped. I sat down at the table. My thoughts were disassociated and incoherent. The peculiar sound at the base of my neck was something I had become keenly aware of. Don Juan had described it as the sound one makes at the moment of changing speed. I had the faint recollection of having experienced it in his company. Although I had become aware of it the previous night, I had not fully acknowledged it until it happened with Rosa. I realized then that the sound had created a special sensation of heat on the roof of my mouth and inside my ears. The force and dryness of the sound made me think of the peal of a large cracked bell. Lydia returned a while later. She seemed more calm and collected. She even smiled. I asked her to please help me unravel that riddle and tell me what had happened. After a long vacillation, she told me that when I had yelled and banged on the table, Rosa got excited and nervous, and believing I was going to hurt them, she had tried to strike me with her dream hand. I had dodged her blow and hit her on the back of her hand the same way I had struck Doña Soledad. Lydia said that Rosa's hand would be useless until I found a way to help her. Rosa walked into the room then. Her arm was wrapped with a piece of cloth. She looked at me. Her eyes were like those of a child. My feelings were at the height of turmoil. Some part of me felt ugly and guilty, but again another part remained unruffled. Had it not been for that part, I would not have survived either Doña Soledad's attack or Rosa's devastating blow. After a long silence, I told them that it was very petty of me to be annoyed by their foot messages, but that there was no comparison between yelling or banging on the table and what Rosa had done. In view of the fact that I had no familiarity with their practices, she could have severed my arm with her blow. I demanded in a very intimidating tone to see her hand. She reluctantly unwrapped it. It was swollen and red. There was no doubt left in my mind that these people were carrying out some sort of test that Don Juan had set up for me. By confronting them, I was being hurled into a realm which was impossible to reach or accept in rational terms. He had said time and time again that my rationality comprised only a very small part of what he had called the totality of oneself. Under the impact of the unfamiliar and the altogether real danger of my physical annihilation, my body had had to make use of its hidden resources, or die. The trick seemed to be in the truthful acceptance of the possibility that such resources exist and can be reached. The years of training had been but the steps to arrive to that acceptance. Truthful to his premise of no compromise, Don Juan had aimed at a total victory or a total defeat for me. If the training had failed to put me in contact with my hidden resources, the test would have made it evident, in which case there would have been very little I could have done. Don Juan had said to Doña Soledad that I would have killed myself. Being such a profound connoisseur of human nature, he was probably right. It was time to adopt a new course of action. Lydia had said that I could help Rosa and Doña Soledad with the same force that had caused them injury. The problem, therefore, was to get the right sequence of feelings, or thoughts, or whatever, that led my body to unleash that force. I took Rosa's hand and rubbed it. I willed it to be cured. I had only the best feelings for her. I caressed her hand and hugged her for a long time. I rubbed her head and she fell asleep on my shoulder, but there was no change in the redness or the swelling. Lydia watched me without saying a word. She smiled at me. I wanted to tell her that I was a fiasco as a healer. Her eyes seemed to catch my mood, and they held it until it froze. Rosa wanted to sleep. She was either dead tired or ill. I didn't want to find out which. I picked her up in my arms. She was lighter than I would have imagined. I took her to Don Juan's bed and gently placed her on it. Lydia covered her. The room was very dark. I looked out of the window and saw a cloudless sky filled with stars. Up to that moment, I had been oblivious to the fact that we were at a very high altitude. As I looked at the sky, I felt a surge of optimism. Somehow the stars looked festive to me. The southeast was indeed a lovely direction to face. I had a sudden urge that I felt obliged to satisfy. I wanted to see how different the view of the sky was from Doña Soledad's window, which faced the north. I took Lydia by the hand with the intention of leading her there, but a ticklish sensation on top of my head stopped me. It went like a ripple down my back to my waist, and from there it went to the pit of my stomach. I sat down on the mat. I made an effort to think about my feelings. It seemed that at the very moment I had felt the tickling on my head, my thoughts had diminished in strength and number. I tried, but I couldn't involve myself in the usual mental process that I call thinking. My mental deliberations made me oblivious to Lydia. She had knelt on the floor facing me. I became aware that her enormous eyes were scrutinizing me from a few inches away. I automatically took her hand again and walked to Doña Soledad's room. As we reached the door, I felt her whole body stiffening. I had to pull her. I was about to cross the threshold when I caught sight of the bulky, dark mass of a human body huddled against the wall opposite the door. The sight was so unexpected that I gasped and let go of Lydia's hand. It was Doña Soledad. She was resting her head against the wall. I turned to Lydia. She had recoiled a couple of steps. I wanted to whisper that Doña Soledad had returned, but there were no sounds to my words, although I was sure I had vocalized them. I would have tried to talk again had it not been that I had an urge to act. It was as if words took too much time, and I had very little of it. I stepped into the room and walked over to Doña Soledad. She appeared to be in great pain. I squatted by her side, and rather than asking her anything, I lifted her face to look at her. I saw something on her forehead. It looked like the plaster of leaves that she had made for herself. It was dark, viscous to the touch. I felt the imperative need to peel it off her forehead. In a very bold fashion, I grabbed her head, tilted it back, and yanked the plaster off. It was like peeling off rubber. She didn't move or complain about pain. Underneath the plaster, there was a yellowish-green blotch. It moved, as if it were alive or imbued with energy. I looked at it for a moment, unable to do anything. I poked it with my finger, and it stuck to it like glue. I didn't panic, as I ordinarily would have. I rather liked the stuff. I stirred it with the tips of my fingers, and all of it came off her forehead. I stood up. The gooey substance felt warm. It was like a sticky paste for an instant, and then it dried up between my fingers and on the palm of my hand. I then felt another jolt of apprehension and ran to Don Juan's room. I grabbed Rosa's arm and wiped the same fluorescent yellowish-green stuff from her hand that I had wiped from Doña Soledad's forehead. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hardly stand on my feet. I wanted to lie down, but something in me pushed me to the window and made me jog on the spot. I cannot recall how long I jogged there. Suddenly I felt that someone was wiping my neck and shoulders. I became aware then that I was practically nude, perspiring profusely. Lydia had a cloth around my shoulders and was wiping the sweat off my face. My normal thought processes came back to me all at once. I looked around the room. Rosa was sound asleep. I ran to Doña Soledad's room. I expected to find her also asleep, but there was no one there. Lydia had trailed behind me. I told her what had happened. She rushed to Rosa and woke her up while I put on my clothes. Rosa didn't want to wake up. Lydia grabbed her injured hand and squeezed it. In one single springing movement, Rosa stood up and was fully awake. They began to rush around the house, turning off the lanterns. They seemed to be getting ready to run away. I wanted to ask them why they were in such a hurry when I realized that I had dressed in a great hurry myself. We were rushing together. Not only that, but they seemed to be waiting for direct commands from me. We ran out of the house carrying all the packages I had brought. Lydia had advised me not to leave any of them behind. I had not yet assigned them, and they still belonged to me. I threw them in the back seat of the car while the two girls crammed into the front. I started the car and backed up slowly, finding my way in the darkness. Once we were on the road, I was brought face to face with the most pressing issue. Both of them said in unison that I was the leader. Their actions were dependent on my decisions. I was the Nagual. We couldn't just run out of the house and drive away aimlessly. I had to guide them. But the truth was that I had no idea where to go or what to do. I turned casually to look at them. The headlights cast a glare inside the car, and their eyes were like mirrors that reflected it. I remembered that Don Juan's eyes did the same. They seemed to reflect more light than the eyes of an average person. I knew that the two girls were aware of my impasse. Rather than making a joke about it in order to cover up my incapacity, I bluntly put the responsibility of a solution in their laps. I said that I lacked practice as the Nagual, and would appreciate it if they would oblige me with a suggestion or a hint as to where we should go. They seemed disgusted with me. They clicked their tongues and shook their heads. I mentally shuffled through various courses of action, none of which was feasible, such as driving them to town, or taking them to Nestor's house, or even taking them to Mexico City. I stopped the car. I was driving toward town. I wanted more than anything else in the world to have a heart-to-heart talk with the girls. I opened my mouth to begin, but they turned away from me, faced each other, and put their arms around each other's shoulders. That appeared to be an indication that they had locked themselves in and were not listening to me. My frustration was enormous. What I craved for at that moment was Don Juan's mastery over any situation at hand, his intellectual companionship, his humor. Instead, I was in the company of two nincompoops. I caught a gesture of dejection in Lydia's face, and that stopped my avalanche of self-pity. I became overtly aware for the first time that there was no end to our mutual disappointment. Obviously, they too were accustomed, although in a different manner, to the mastery of Don Juan. For them, the shift from the Nagual himself to me must have been disastrous. I sat for a long while with the motor running. Then, all at once, I again had a bodily shiver that started on the top of my head as a ticklish sensation, and I knew then what had happened when I had entered Doña Soledad's room a while before. I had not seen her in an ordinary sense. What I had thought was Doña Soledad huddled against the wall was in fact the memory of her leaving her body the instant after I had hit her. I also knew that when I touched that gooey phosphorescent substance, I had cured her, and that it was some sort of energy I had left in her head and in Rosa's hand with my blows. A vision of a particular ravine went through my mind. I became convinced that Doña Soledad and La Gorda were there. My knowledge was not a mere conjecture. It was rather a truth that needed no further corroboration. La Gorda had taken Doña Soledad to the bottom of that particular ravine and was at that precise moment attempting to cure her. I wanted to tell her that it was wrong to treat the swelling in Doña Soledad's forehead and that there was no longer a need for them to stay there. I described my vision to the girls. Both of them told me, the way Don Juan used to tell me, not to indulge. With him, however, that reaction was more congruous. I had never really minded his criticisms or scorn, but the two girls were in a different league. I felt insulted. "I'll take you home," I said. "Where do you live?" Lydia turned to me and in a most furious tone said that both of them were my wards, and that I had to deliver them to safety, since at the request of the Nagual they had relinquished their freedom to act in order to help me. I had a fit of anger at that point. I wanted to slap the two girls, but then I felt the curious shiver running through my body once more. It started again as a tickling on top of my head, which went down my back until it reached my umbilical region, and then I knew where they lived. The ticklishness was like a shield, a soft, warm sheet of film. I could sense it physically, covering the area between my pubis and the edge of my rib cage. My wrath disappeared, and was replaced by a strange sobriety, an aloofness, and at the same time a desire to laugh. I knew then of something transcendental. Under the impact of Doña Soledad and the little sister's actions, my body had suspended judgment. I had, in Don Juan's terms, stopped the world. I had amalgamated two disassociated sensations: the ticklishness on the very top of my head and the dry cracking sound at the base of my neck. Between them lay the means to that suspension of judgment. As I sat in my car with those two girls on the side of a deserted mountain road, I knew for a fact that for the first time I had had a complete awareness of stopping the world.